The older I get, the more I read, the more I travel, the more I listen to the Spirit's prompting, the more I'm convinced that God is really going to hold us church leaders accountable for how we treated the poor, the vulnerable, the widows and orphans.
You don't have to do everything. You don't have to help every single person, but you do have to do something.
We want to be part of the social revolution that is the gospel. The whole gospel, W-H-O-L-E. There's this question that Jesus asks in one of the Gospels that has had a chilling effect on me, and it's a simple question. He turned to his followers and he said this, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, but do not do what I say?" Wow, what an indictment. How many of us, how many of our churches call him Lord, Lord, but really don't do what he says? You know, in the book of James, we're told that faith without works is dead. Show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith by what I do. This is what we're called to, and this is the great opportunity of our generation that's been given to us by the Lord. He's equipped the American church, the wealthiest community of Christians in the history of Christendom. There has never been a community of Christians with as much wealth, with as much knowledge and education and capacity as the American church. The question is, what will we do with that which God has entrusted to us? My hope and my belief is that we can and we will change the world, take up the challenge, and go into the world in the name of Christ, to change the world as we know it, to make a difference, to be there for the hurting and the suffering, the broken, the widow and the orphan.
And when I say that these churches were involved in holistic ministry, I mean that they were offering the whole gospel to the whole person in the whole community. They were convinced that God had called them to join him in redeeming and restoring all things in this broken and sin-stained world.
One of the places that probably stands out as the most despairing place we've ever been is in northern Uganda. World Vision has had for a number of years an operation there where they take children who've been found in the field or who've wandered away from the army and work with them to rehabilitate them, to be able to prepare them so that they can go back into their villages. You can imagine if as a small boy you've been taken as an army soldier and forced to kill and to maim people that you know, even your own parents, you can imagine the impact that that has on the life of a child. And so World Vision has worked for a number of years with counselors and pastors to help these children prepare for reintegration into their villages. We were there about 3 years ago, I believe. You could see when the boys got out of the car, one of them had a withered arm. He'd been hit by shrapnel. The other little boy, just terrified. They were probably 13, 14 years old, not knowing what was going to happen to them as they came to this rehabilitation center. And the amazing thing was that the other children who were there came and rushed the car. Imagine their horror, but they rushed the car to welcome them. They began to sing a song that in their language was, "You are welcome here, you are welcome here." And they were taken from the car into sort of a makeshift chapel that was at the rehabilitation center and made to be the guests of honor. Rich talks about what happened there is a little bit like the prodigal son coming back to be welcomed into the arms of a loving father, to realize that these children, no matter what the horrific things they had done as part of this army, were being welcomed back into the family of God was a life-changing thing. You could see in the little boy's posture, shoulders that relaxed, faces that were not so drawn, just experiencing the love of God through the other children who had also gone through the same horrific experiences they did. In this same rehabilitation center, we met a woman named Margaret. Margaret was a woman who had been attacked while she was tending her garden. She was several months pregnant, and the Lord's Resistance Army came and killed her friends as they gardened, but they didn't want to kill Margaret because Margaret was pregnant, and they thought that would be bad luck. And so instead of killing Margaret, they cut off her lips, they cut off her nose, they cut off her ears and left her for dead, hoping, of course, or anticipating that she would die there in the field. But the other villagers discovered what had happened to her and took her to the local hospital, and she had been saved from death, but not from this horrible disfiguration. We met Margaret, and having had several surgeries so that she could again use her mouth and speak and begin to sort of live a normal life again. But the amazing thing was that Margaret's attacker had also come to the rehabilitation center. Can you imagine having had this terrible thing happen to you and then realizing that one of the boys who had done this to you was being welcomed into the rehabilitation center that you had seen as a safe haven? Of course, she was terrified and ran from the area, didn't want anything to do with this young man. But the World Vision staff there began to work with her to talk about what it meant to forgive, what it meant that God loved her so much that He had forgiven her, and in turn then she needed to forgive this young man. And they also began to work with this young man to tell him that he had done this terrible thing and he needed to confess that to this young woman and to ask her forgiveness. And is in an amazing, amazing scene I will never forget. We had the opportunity to see Margaret and her little girl and this young man together conversing, and in fact the man holding her little girl. There had been a wonderful process of forgiveness and reconciliation that had taken place because both of them had recognized that God had forgiven them and that they in turn were to forgive others. I can't imagine having been Margaret and realizing that my attacker was there in this same rehabilitation center with me, and then knowing that because of what God had done for me, that I had to bridge that gap with Him.
No, I think the lesson I learned in Gulu more than anywhere else is that God has called us into the darkness. We have the light of the gospel. Jesus always talked about us being light in the world, in a dark world. And we're called to go out with this gospel, with this light, to light the darkest places in our world, whether they're dark because of this kind of violence and butchery or maiming that we saw in northern Uganda, or whether it's darkness related to poverty or trafficking of children or political corruption. But the world is a dark place, and Christ calls us not to sit safely in our pews in the light, but to take the light out into the darkness, to illuminate the world and to redeem it and reclaim it with the gospel. And in this dark place of Gulu, Uganda, one of the darkest places I've ever been, the gospel shone brighter than I'd ever seen it shine before.
You know, Hebrews challenges us, since we are surrounded by such a crowd of witnesses, let us throw off everything that entangles and the sin that so easily besets us, and run with perseverance the race set before us. And that race will look different for each of us, but He doesn't want us sitting on the sidelines. He doesn't want us waiting for some great call, specifically, hey Renee, I want you to come and help me. He's given us what He wants us to do. He's given us a charge, and He expects us to follow Him. And if we were honest about ourselves, most of us know what that looks like.
By the year 2015, get ready, 115 million people will have perished from this disease. 35 million children will join the ranks of the AIDS orphans. And the church just cannot sit idly by or claim ignorance or rationalize non-engagement. Every church should do something.
I really hope that the world is looking at Christ followers and saying, man, that is a people of action. They are really getting things done. That if you come to a point in crisis in your life, the first thing you think of is, where can I find a local church? Because I know people there are going to understand and are going to feel empathy for me and have compassion for my life and are going to help me in my situation.
It's too hard. It's too overwhelming. And it's too spiritually dark. It's too big for governments. It's too big for NGOs like World Vision. It's too big for the United Nations and the World Bank. But it's not too big for the Church of Jesus Christ, mobilized to the front lines of compassion.
And I think that's all God is asking of you as leaders of churches. Give it a shot. Get off dead center. Move in the direction of compassion. God will meet you along the way.
I've had the privilege of being with you by video these past 6 weeks as you've gone through these 6 lessons from the whole in our gospel. And now it's commitment time. And the question comes to you, what does God expect of you? And what are you going to do with the things that you now know, the things that you've learned from Scripture and from these lessons? You have a choice, each one of you. You can go home after this lesson concludes and put all these materials in the bookshelf and get on with your lives. Or you can say, you know, I'm going to change something. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do something about it. You know, our founder, Bob Pierce, back in 1950, was confronted with that question. Bob Pierce, what are you going to do about it? He saw the plight of one child in China. It was actually in the late 1940s. And this missionary woman turned to Bob Pierce and said, what are you going to do about it? Well, he took that question very seriously, and the result of his answer to that question is he said, well, I'm just one person, but maybe I can start a little organization. I'll call it World Vision. Imagine a man with no money, no particular skills, who starts a little charity and he says, I'm going to call it World Vision. I'm not going to call it China Vision or India Vision. I'm going to call it World Vision. But that was what Bob Pierce did. He started this little organization that's blossomed into one of the largest humanitarian Christian organizations in the world. Just because one man answered the question, what are you going to do about it, and decided that he could make a difference. So what about you? What are you going to do about the things that you've learned? I think of the people I talk about in the book, young Austin Gutwine, who at 9 years old heard about the AIDS orphans in Africa and said he needed to do something about it. He told his mother and father, who probably thought, oh, Austin, you're 9 years old, what can you do? But he said, look, I like basketball. I like to shoot free throws. Maybe there's something I can do to raise money for those orphans. And so he started Hoops of Hope, a little organization where he would shoot free throws, one free throw for every one of the children that were orphaned somewhere in the world during that particular school day on World AIDS Day. And he raised a few $100s, a few $1,000s the first time. Well, now, a few years later, Austin has raised, through Hoops of Hope, more than $1 million to help those orphans in Africa. I think of the shoeshine man in Seattle, Leon McLaughlin, who I've met, who went to Bolivia on a travel vacation trip and learned about the shortage of clean water in Bolivia. He came back, he did some research, he found out that there were water purification systems that could be used. He put pictures up at his shoeshine stand in Seattle, and people would ask about the pictures, and Leon would tell them about the need for clean water in Bolivia and how for a few $1,000s a water filtration could be installed to bring hundreds of people clean water. And he started to get donations. And he's put 6 or 8 of those clean water systems now in Bolivia. You see, every one of us can do something. We may not think we're smart enough or talented enough or skilled enough to do anything. But just like that little boy who brought his lunch to Jesus that day and said, I've got some loaves and fishes, take these, Jesus. We have something. Just like Moses had that stick in his hand, that staff, and he said, Lord, who am I? I'm not eloquent, I can't speak well. Who am I to go to Pharaoh in Egypt and lead your people out of captivity? And the Lord said, what is that in your hand, Moses? And he said, a stick, a shepherd's staff. And the Lord used that stick in Moses' hand to change the world, to part the Red Sea, to perform miracles for the next 40 years. So the question comes back, what about you? What will you do when this study is over? What will your plan be? How will you assess your time, your talent, and your treasures? And how will you work with your friends or your family or your children to say, this is what we're going to do. This is our piece of God's vision for our world. We want to be part of the social revolution that is the gospel. The whole gospel, W-H-O-L-E, not a gospel with a hole in it, not a watered down, anemic gospel, a tame gospel, but the big and the powerful and the awesome gospel of Jesus Christ that we've been given, we've been entrusted to, the opportunity to change the world. Take the opportunity, make the difference, do something about it. Thanks.